Good morning to everyone to this new initiative of Fondazione Enrico Mattei. As you probably may know, we have been following COP since ever, I would say. And just to say for the current date, we followed the COP28, and we are planning to go also following a COP29. So we thought it would be nice to have a sort of transition discussion about what is the heritage or experience we can learn from COP28 that brings our attention to COP29, and furthermore to see if there is what we say, an Italian road. So what is the position of our government vis-a-vis the new COP that will be held, as you know, in Baku. After my very short introduction, there will be a speech by Fatih Birol from Paris. Fatih needs no introduction. Basically, it's the executive director of the International Energy Agency. Then there is there will be a presentation from Professor Corvaro, which is a special envoy for climate change of Italy, of our country. Then Enzo Di Giulio, which is the dean of Scuola Mattei, any corporate university. Then we would like to enter into some more specific aspects of the discussion, particularly on Africa, and Professor Pontoni, which is program director at FEEM, will present some thoughts about Africa and energy transition. And then the conclusions will be in the end of Professor Galeotti, which is from FEEM and University of Milan, beside being a well-known expert in these issues since a long time. For the one of you that want to present, to propose questions, there is we will see a space in your internet screen. You can send your question, written question, and I will see your question in my iPad, and I will present your question to our experts, and we will try to keep the timely. And so I think without any further hesitation, I would like to give the floor to Fatih Birol from Paris. Fatih.
Dear colleagues, good morning to all of you from International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. I am very sorry that I cannot be with you in Milan today, but I thought I could share a few thoughts with you as far as the IEA's work on COP28, COP29, and COP30. We get a lot of questions from the institutions, governments, media, and others. Why International Energy Agency, an energy organization, takes the climate change so seriously and tries to lead the fight against climate change from the energy sector? Our answer is very simple. About 80% of the emissions causing climate change comes from the energy sector, using fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And without transforming the energy sector, we have no chance whatsoever to address our climate challenge and to have a livable planet for all of us. We take climate crisis as a key priority together with our energy security mandate. Along those lines, we worked very closely with the COP28 presidency. We made our analysis, and what we have come up is the following. Throughout our analysis, throughout our discussions with the COP28 presidents and many governments, well before the meeting in Dubai, we said, in order to consider COP28 as a successful one from the energy sector point of view, from IEA point of view, we have 5 criteria that we would like to see in the outcome document. What are those? Number 1, we would like to see, we said, that the governments agree tripling their renewable capacity by 2030. Second, we said we would like to see a commitment from the governments to improve, to double the energy efficiency improvement between now and 2030. Then we also said, thirdly, that the methane emissions, very important, very potent gas, governments and the companies need to agree to reduce their methane emissions big time, 75%. Fourth, and maybe a very critical one, we said there should be a commitment moving away from fossil fuels in a just and orderly manner. And fifth, and the last one, we said for the emerging and developing countries, we need to create mechanisms in order to help them to finance their clean energy transitions. And when we look at the results, so-called UAE consensus, we see many of them, not all, but many of them were in the outcome document. And as such, I believe this document is a very important document and gives a direction to the global energy markets for the next years to come. More importantly, among all, is the very expression that the world needs to move away, transitioning away from fossil fuels. So we were very happy with these results, because this document was signed off by 200 governments around the world, and we very much hope that the governments would fulfill their commitments. Right after the COP meeting, we had our ministerial meeting. It was our 50th anniversary. We had more than 50 governments accounting more than 80% of the global energy use came together to Paris to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And in their communiqué at the end of the meeting, our governments endorsed the UAE consensus and gave IEA to lead to implementation of COP28 results. And in fact, recently, only a few days ago, I convened a big meeting in Paris at IEA headquarters, where Dr. 𝕎𝕓 𝔼𝕬𝐺, the president of the COP28, was the keynote speaker. It was his first international speech about the COP28, but we also had several other so-called heavyweights, Secretary Kerry, Laurent Fabius, who was the president of the historic Paris Agreement, COP21, the COP29 presidency, the chief negotiator of Azerbaijan, the climate secretary of Brazil, many ministers and climate change negotiators, and over 80 ambassadors of different countries. We discussed what are the next steps. And they all were happy with the results, and many governments, including the Dr. 𝕎𝕓 𝔼𝕬𝐺, praised, among others, one of the ways to reach this consensus, namely, almost 1 year, UAE and the IEA organized so-called high-level dialogues, bringing governments around the table, the closed-door meetings, to have a consensus on these issues. These meetings took place at the margins of the G20 meeting in India, in Nairobi when we had the Africa Climate Summit, in the United Nations General Assembly among others. And the last one was, in fact, in Dubai itself. And in this meeting in Paris, when I brought all the climate change negotiators, Sultan Al-Jabbar and others, we also agreed with the Azeri government that Azerbaijan and the International Energy Agency, we are going to organize a series of high-level dialogues between now and Baku meeting. And this is, of course, an important step to find a consensus on the very topic of the Baku COP29 presidency, which is the finance issue, which, in my view, one of the fault lines of the world reaching its climate targets. I was very happy that the Italian Special Envoy on Climate, Mr. Corvaro, was also in the meeting, because I believe the Italian G7 presidency can play an important role to foster the dialogue between G7 countries, that is guests, especially to reach our targets, the 5 targets I mentioned to you. And I'm very happy that the Italian G7 presidency also pays a lot of attention to Africa and African energy and climate issues, and as such, Mattei plan is a very good example. Dear colleagues, at the IEA, we take the COP process very seriously, not only COP29, but also COP30, which is going to be presided by Brazil. Only 3 weeks ago, I was in Brasilia, invited by President Lula. I had meetings with President Lula, the Climate Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Energy, and all others. And I see that Brazil, which is going to chair this year the G20 presidency, and next year COP30 presidency, is very excited to host these 2 important international gatherings. And I believe climate change and the just energy transition is at the heart of their policy agenda. As far as the IEA is concerned, we are from now to end of this year, we are going to do 4+1 thing, as I say, in order to implement the COP28 results. The first one is tracking. We trust governments that they will honor their signature in Dubai, but we thought it is also good to see what they say and what they do. So we are going to build a tracking mechanism, what the countries said in terms of renewables, efficiency, and methane, and others, and what they are doing in the real life. We are going to do and publish these results in cooperation with the UNFCCC Secretariat, and we'll make it publicly available, the performance of the countries who signed this very important document. Second, this year, governments are in the process of preparing their next NDCs, and we will work with many governments to help them to prepare their NDCs in light with their national circumstances, but also reaching our scientific climate targets. So this is the second area that we are going to work on, which we think is another important step. The third one is, as I mentioned to you, we are going to work with the Azeri government to organize a series of high-level dialogues, because financing, the main topic of the Azeri, the COP29 presidency, in my view, is one of the most critical ones, and we will try to bring all the parties, both the countries in the north, in the south, and the financing institutions together to be able to support the emerging and developing countries for their efforts to support the clean energy transitions in the emerging and developing countries in their energy markets for renewable energy, energy efficiency, hydrogen, and others. The fourth one is that the countries, the United Arab Emirates, Azerbaijan, and Brazil put together a troika in order to push the agenda forward, and we are going to provide a strategic advice to them. These are the four areas that we are going to push to see that the results of COP28 they are implemented. What is the plus one? Plus one is a topic which is very important for the IE and for me personally, and my friend Alessandro Lanza knows this very well. This is a key topic in Africa. Namely, our analysis show that today 4 out of 5 families in Africa use primitive cook stoves, wood, agricultural waste, animal waste for preparing their meals. And it's mainly women who go to the forest, cut the trees, take the wood, bring it back home, and cook their meals through these primitive cook stoves, which emits a lot of toxic material. And this is a major problem because it causes respiratory diseases for women, and these respiratory diseases are one of the 2 main reasons for premature death for women in Africa. Every year, 500,000 women, 500,000 women in sub-Saharan Africa die prematurely because of using wood for cooking. Yet our analysis also show that this problem can be solved for once and forever by putting $4 billion annually to move from primitive cooking to modern cooking practices. $4 billion is not a big money. If I have to put it in a context, in Europe, after the 24th of February, 2 years ago, when we hit the starting of the energy crisis in Europe, we built about 12 LNG terminals. And building one LNG facility costs about $25 billion, one of them. And with $4 billion, you would change the lives of hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, to put in a context. In order to address this issue, we are bringing several governments around the world to Paris, to IEA on 14th of May, a major summit co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Norway, Prime Minister 𝐸, and the President of Tanzania, Madam Suluhu. And we are going to co-host this meeting with the African Development Bank, and several heads of states will be there. And we expect that the countries, investors, energy companies will put money, resources on the table, and we will have a roadmap in order to address this issue. And I believe this is a critical one. It's an energy issue, climate issue, gender issue, and a humanitarian issue. Dear colleagues, at the IEA, we take climate change seriously, we take energy security seriously, and we take the energy poverty very seriously. And I am very happy that the Italian G7 presidency will look at all these issues, and International Energy Agency is happy to work with the Italian government and other governments to address these 3 important planetary crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatih. It's always a pleasure to see you. Fatih has been a friend for me, and particularly for this institution. He remembered a study we did probably 30 years ago on energy poverty and so-called non-commercial energy the application in Africa. So it's a discussion, it's a never-ending discussion among ourselves long time ago. Let me also add that Fatih is leaving, basically. So unfortunately, even if there is any question for him, he won't be able to take it because he's basically leaving. So without, I will give the floor to Professor Corvaro, which is a special envoy for climate change, which presents some of our thoughts about his thoughts about the Italian position vis-a-vis all these issues. Francesco, floor is yours.
Thanks. Good morning to everyone, and thanks again for the invitation. As you see with the message of Birol, there is a lot work to do, but moreover, we have a strong position in the COP commit from Italy. So yesterday we received a letter from the Troika. Troika is the union of the three COP presidencies, COP28, COP29, and COP30, to understand which is their decisions to follow the direction that we obtain in COP28. COP28, as you know, is an historical event because for the first time inside the declaration, we have the transitioning away from fossil fuel. But moreover, there are a lot of other important aspects to put in evidence from my side. And this is, and in particular, the first one is one that is strongly connected with the Italian activity, is the natural transition, natural technology transition. So if you read in the final documents of COP28, we can find a list of different technologies that must be used if we want to obtain a net zero in 2050. We have the renewable energy, and there is a lot of work in this direction to triple the energy, renewable energy installations and efficiency. But the second one is the nuclear energy. Then we found hydrogen, CCS, carbon capture system, and other technologies. This put in evidence this peculiar element. We have to use everything that we have to arrive to the target of the Paris Agreement. Because if we think to maintain the target of 1.5 Celsius degree, we need really to improve, but moreover to use everything. For example, yesterday I went to Brussels with our Vice Premier Tajani to subscribe the statement proposed by Grossi about the nuclear energy use in the world and in all of countries that want to arrive to net zero in 2050. This is crucial. But I told you that we received this letter yesterday from the Troika, and we have some specific points that we can put in evidence following the pathway from COP28 to COP30. The first one is that in this, that they created a sort of list, and first of all, we have to remember that the next COP will be crucial from a financial point of view. COP28 was a big success, and everyone is very worried about the next one because the next one is focused on the financial theme. And financial is not so easy. First of all, because we need to decide the next NCQG for the next 5 years, and this is not clear which is the direction of the European Community, the umbrella group, and some other group inside the COP. We are discussing with the European community about which can be our target, our proposal. The European community is, as you know, wants to maintain a leadership in the green transition, and for this reason, we want to increase the ambitions under this aspect. But at that moment, we are under discussion, and there isn't a precise decision in this direction. Then another important element connected from COP28 to COP29 is the need to prepare the new NDC. In fact, 9 months before COP30, so more or less some months after the COP29, we should receive all the NDCs from different countries. And this is crucial because everyone inside the COP presidencies of Azerbaijan is pushing a lot to increase their ambitions. Then this element can create some problem inside the negotiation, because there are different levels inside the perspective of these of targets, and in particular there are some countries that don't like very much to increase the target in their NDC, because then this target should be mandatory. So there are a lot of discussion to indicate a roadmap to obtain 1.5 Celsius degree starting from COP28 and COP30. The idea to create the Troika from my side is a good solution, because give us a possibility to understand which can be the roadmap in this kind of in the climate diplomacy. We need to cooperate. We need to create a strong connection between all the countries, and then this can be increased if the different presidencies are connected. And this is a great idea to give also a big support to the Baku COP at the end of this year, because as I told you, speaking about the finance, funds, and so on is not an easy COP. I want also to put in evidence another aspect that we find in this direction is the loss and damage fund. Finally, we decided the group that must follow this fund, the commit, and now we are ready to propose and to write the rules for this loss and damage fund. That is extremely important for the developing countries that that are under very bad condition in, for example, very critical bad weather condition for climate change. So more or less we are in this situation. The rule of Italy is crucial for 2 reasons. The first one, because the idea of Italy is to propose a pragmatical solution for climate change. What I started to say in all the meetings is that Italy wants a sustainable future, but to arrive to a sustainable future, it is crucial to have a sustainable present. So it is important to follow the transitioning using the considering also the social and economic aspect. With the background to maintain everyone in this pathway and don't leave anyone behind. This is crucial for this side. The second one, we are working hard on the transitioning connected with the equal technology. So all the technologies that we can use must be used to obtain the result. I met the COP29 team in Nairobi during the UNIA, and obviously we discussed a lot about the financial aspect, but what they said to me is this: Professor, we want to be very clear. We know that the topic is the financial, but we want also to maintain some other important targets. We don't want, they said me, that they don't want to connect only the COP29 to a problem of money in an easy way, because I know that this can create a big fight against the North, against the South. So they are strongly involved to maintain all other topics that started in COP28. For example, they asked me in particular two important elements. The first one, the role of Italy inside the food security and agriculture. As you know, we proposed an important statement in COP28, and it was the statement that received more support. The second one is the role of the younger generation. At Nairobi, I met also the youth delegate, and they want also to maintain this important level inside the COP. To open not all, in particular to younger generation, but also to civil society. Returning to the discussion of the financial aspect, we agreed with them that it is important to involve in this discussion also the private sector. And this is a mandatory request that I received also from Minister Tajani, that is strongly convinced that obviously from a public point of view, we don't have enough money to fight against the climate change, so it is crucial to involve also the private sector. But to do this, and this is one of the topics that I would like to put in the G7 agenda, we need to increase the risk management insurance in the developing countries. If we want to involve in this discussion also the private sector, we need to improve this aspect. The needs to the evaluation of the risk and the insurance. But to do this is crucial the adaptation. Adaptation projects must be improved. In fact, in this letter that we received some days ago, yesterday, I don't remember precisely, the adaptation is underlined from Troika because it's crucial, is a baseline if we want to improve the investment inside the developing countries to move forward COP28, COP29, and COP30. And in this aspect, probably the public funds must play an important role. Finally, obviously, in the roadmap from COP28 and COP29, for Italy is crucial the role of the African region. You know that we have the Mattei plan. We started some important project. I don't know if you remember that the Mattei plan put in evidence 6 different aspects: education, energy, infrastructure, health, food and agriculture, and water. We started some pilot project in different countries like Tunisia, Mozambique, Congo, and so on. But this is only the starting point. Yesterday, I spoke with Ambassador Gatti, that is our special envoy for food security, but also the director of the DGSC of the Foreign Minister and Cooperation, and he went in Africa for 10 days to understand which are the needs of specific countries. And the second trip is planning for the April month. So as you know, Italy is involved in a lot of discussion under the pathway from COP28 and COP29. But what I want to put in evidence that we are in a roadmap that is looking in this direction of COP30 in Brazil. So for the first time, we have a program. If we want, we have a line we have that is put in evidence in COP28. And as I said a lot of time, if we could to put on the ground what we decide in COP28, this could be a wonderful result, because inside the COP28 we can find a lot of important decisions. Someone said to me that COP28 could be more ambitious. For sure, is a possibility, but as I try to explain, it's not easy to put in the same level different countries, some very rich, some other with a very difficult situation, and everyone must decide or adopt the same decision. It's not easy. For this reason, from my side, is an historical COP, and we are working hard to maintain the same level in COP29. In particular, Italy try to avoid a fight between the south and the north area. So we need to open not only a discussion of money, but in particular to give support also in technology for the developing countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very insightful, full of many possible discussion, many possible questions, I presume. I know that you also have a problem that you have to leave before, if I understood correctly. Anyway, now we have a speech from Enzo Di Giulio, which is the Dean of Scuola Mattei, which is a very promising title, which is the status of current negotiation, which is fair enough. But then there is the possible solutions. That's a totally a different story, I presume. So, Enzo, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, and all the organizers for your invitation. Yes, I agree with you. So the topic is quite tough because you put in the title of my presentation of the word possible solution. I go to share my presentation. You should be able to see it now. So possible solutions, and so let me say that I don't have solutions. So I will share with you some reflections, and I will do this by looking at the negotiation process, but also trying to open a bit the landscape. So I try to reflect on this issue, the status of the current negotiation, where we are. And in carrying out an evaluation, I came out with the following hypothesis. That is, we could do an evaluation looking at the negotiation process in itself, that is inside the negotiation process, the documents, what's happening there. And on the other hand, we have to look at what happens outside, that is in real life. So a possible scheme could be the following one. On the one hand, we can carry out an inside evaluation, and this inside evaluation can be on two grounds. So the first ground is the language. So what is the language of the negotiation process? So what is written in the different declarations? What we find there? And on the other end, we have to see the numbers, because the numbers are important. But here I am referring to the numbers within the negotiation process. And we can repeat this scheme when we look outside. It is when we look at what is happening in real life, what the countries are doing, what are their plans and ambitions, and what are their emissions. So let's start with the inside evaluation, so content by words. So this process starts, it focuses in Paris, so starts with Paris. So Paris, I think, is a success in itself, because for the first time here we have a declaration of this target, over target of 2 degrees Celsius or better, 1.5. It is interesting to notice that the European Union proposed this target in '96. So it took about 20 years for the other countries, the rest of the world, reaching the level of ambition of the European Union. So after COP21, Paris, many things happens, but basically these are technical years. There are other COPs that try to discuss and to find a solution about the rules of the game, what is called the Paris rule book. So we jump to COP21, COP26, that is Glasgow, which is important because, as you know, according to the negotiation process, there must be an improvement of the targets every 5 years. So 5 years from Paris was 2020, but there was COVID, so the conference was shifted in 21. So in Glasgow, I think we find some elements of improvement. So the target is now 1.5 because scientists told that 2 degrees is too risky. And we experience here a change in the language of the negotiation, in the jargon. And so new sentences emerge. So phase down of unabated coal, phase out of inefficient subsidies to fossils. And laterally to the conference, that is not inside the declaration, we have very important initiatives about methane, about the preservation of forests, about finance. So in COP26, there was a strong focus on finance and about the exit from coal. And also, COP26 was important because India declared a net zero target in 2070. So there is here some improvement. And a year later in Sharm, there is another step forward with the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund. That is very important. It is something that was requested by developing countries for about 30 years, and finally in Sharm el-Sheikh that was agreed. And then we moved to Dubai, COP28. I think that COP28 is in a way very important step forward. To some extent, it is a jump. Here we have an improvement in the operational content of the negotiation process, because here for the first time we have targets, quantitative targets about renewables. That is the capacity of renewables must be multiplied ×3 by 2030, and so the energy efficiency improvements must be multiplied twice. That is the same in 2030. And there is some step forward about the loss and damage fund. And also in the language, there is an improvement, because the famous issue of the phasing out from fossil fuels finds a solution. I mean a sort of compromise with this famous expression, transitioning away from fossils. And outside the conference, there is a declaration to triple nuclear energy by about 20 countries that by 2050. So here we see an improvement. That is, the improvement is in the level of ambitions that we can read in the words, in the language, in the expressions, but also the operational content of the COPs is better now, because we have this reference to the new capacity of renewables and energy efficiency. And as Fatih Birol told some minutes ago, that is something that comes from the International Energy Agency, because these targets, these two targets are 2 out of the 5 targets, pillars of the last World Energy Outlook published by the agency in November, I think. When we go to see the numbers, I am afraid that we don't find the same level of improvement. So the big contradiction of Paris was that there was not coherence between the target implied in the NDC and the meta target, the final target of 2 degrees. And so there was a surplus about 23, 27 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That was the surplus associated to the NDC. And this surplus must be eliminated, of course, if we want to go really to net zero. And if there must be this improvement that is contained in the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement says that the NDC must be improved every 5 years. And when we go to Glasgow, we don't see that improvement. So in Glasgow, the target becomes 1.5, and the UNFCCC starts to publish some report laterally to the conference that clarifies the numbers and says that in order to have 1.5 degrees, we have to cut emissions by 45% in 2030 versus 2010. But the new NDCs that are stated in Glasgow don't bring to minus 45, but they bring to plus 13.7%, which is a huge gap, a huge distance. And even if we include the net zero emissions target that meanwhile the countries declared not within the negotiation process but outside, we end up with a cut in emissions by minus 5.2%, which firstly is not minus 45%. It is still a big distance. And ironically, is the target of the Kyoto Protocol. It seems that we went back to 20 years before. Then there is SHARM, new NDC, because the progress of Glasgow was that now the countries can state their NDC every year when they want. So they must not wait every 5 years. And so new NDCs are stated, and so the surplus passes according to the UNFCCC. These are, formal data, by plus 13.7 to plus 10.6%. It is still a huge gap. Finally, we end up with COP28, and here you can see we remain with this gap. It is between 20 and 24 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And so in these 8 years, from Paris 15 to Dubai 23, we see that the gap is reduced very little. That is less than 500 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, and that is too little. And this is the famous emission gap report by UNEP, and basically we should go here. That is the line where we should go, and we are here. So that is our trajectory. And we remain with this gap. That is about 20, 24, 22 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So we are not on the right trajectory, and this is in the ambitions of the countries, not in the reality, in the ambitions of the countries. Now, Dubai introduces some progress in improvement. So there are these two targets about renewables and energy efficiency. Let's say something about this. Now, tripling renewables capacity means that the speed of penetration of renewables in the generation of electricity must increase. That basically we should pass from the average annual growth rate of the last decade, around 11% to 14.7%. So it is, I mean, it's not something huge, no, but I mean, is 3.5% per year. More, it's not easy, even because as the process goes on, there is an enlargement of the basis, so the denominator becomes larger, and so it's difficult to keep the growth rate high. The same reflection applies to the energy intensity improvement, because here there must be a doubling, and the doubling is not easy. Here are some data, and you can see that there are some countries, especially emerging markets, developing economies, in which the decrease of the energy intensity is quite slow. Having said this, so progress is on the level of the language, static landscape on the ground of the numbers, data. Let's see what happens outside. So outside, I think there is a big change. So years 2019, 2020 are, I would say, revolutionary years, because here we see that a new language emerge, a new level of ambition emerge, and there are many countries here. These are some of the countries at any latitude and any continent that state net zero emissions targets. And so if we compare these with what we had 10-15 years before, so at the time of the Kyoto Protocol, in which that -5% seemed to be very ambitious, so that is a revolution. And even on the level of the policies that are declared, we have many steps forward. So in Europe, we have the famous Fit for 55. So here the level of ambition is very high. In the US, we have another way of doing, so a lot of incentives with the famous Biden's IRA, so about 0.8 trillion. So there are many numbers about the dimension of the flow of money going to clean energy. Probably, I mean, the most correct is the one that refers to about $800 billion until 2030, which is a lot of money. And in India, we have the 5 years plan, the last one, which is very ambitious. So reducing carbon intensity by 18%, reducing energy intensity by 13.5%. So these are big numbers. So the ambition grew. And it is higher than what we read in the documents for some countries. So for instance, in China, we are now experiencing a huge penetration of electric cars, and the share of sales increased a lot. So this is an article that you can find in Carbon Brief. There are a couple of articles, very interesting articles about what's going on in China. So huge expansion of EV. Also, what happened to the solar capacity. You can see the histogram in 2023. So the capacity more than doubled compared to the year before. That was a record. So 2022 was a record. And so according to this investigation, the clean sector contributed to the growth of Chinese GDP by about 1/3, which is a lot. So things are going in the right direction, but not enough. Not enough, because at the moment all these renewable capacity does not translate in effective energy demand. And so we see the last data, so only 30% of the China recent energy demand growth has been met by renewables. And this implies that China is not on track for reaching its carbon intensity target. And so something more should be done in the following 2 years. It is this year 24 and the next one 25. I am referring to China because China is a big player, is about 27% of the world emissions, and so it's important here. Even Europe, even the European Union has got a very, very ambitious target, and at the moment is not on track. There must be here an acceleration by the European Union. However, if we look at the situation in a wider perspective, we have to recognize that developed countries are doing something, exceptional, because they were able to bring the level of their emissions to the level that there was 50 years ago. That is a success. And there are countries like the UK in which we see a structural process, a deep structural process of decarbonization. So here we go back, the level of emissions in 23 is like the level in 1879. That is, we go back to 150 years ago. So that is a success. That is an example of perfect decoupling. That is, the economy continue to grow and the emissions went down. And we have many countries in which this is happening. We have examples of decoupling, separation between GDP growth and trend in emissions, but globally at the moment that is not enough. And so if we consider the planet as a whole, we see that we don't experience decoupling. We experience relative decoupling, that is, emissions grow less than GDP, and that is good. But what we need is decoupling. That is, we need a perfect separation. That is, emissions must go down, and this is not happening, and we don't see this at the global level. And that is the reality. It must be admitted that we are facing this situation in spite of all of the ambitions stated in the COP processes, in the declarations, and in the policies stated by the countries. And as a matter of fact, we have seen that this year emissions grew by 1.1%, even this year. And so let's go back to the Paris Agreement, and we see that since the Paris Agreement, the emissions always grew, apart from 2020, the COVID parenthesis, then there was always an increase. And so that means that Paris is not working. So that must be recognized, because it is in the numbers. So the number says that emissions are not decreasing, but emissions are increasing. So the hope is that we are, establishing, we are building the foundation for something that will change completely the direction of our the economic car in the next years. But at the moment, we don't see this. And that is something that we must admit. So synthesis on climate negotiation. So words, there is an improvement in the ambition, in the language, in the operational content. So the level of the numbers, there is still a large gap between the overall target, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the NDC. Something similar happens when we look at the outside evaluations and improvements in the ambitions and policies, more in developed countries than in developing ones, but we do not see decoupling. Unfortunately, we don't see decoupling. Decoupling seems to be still far from us. So that is the situation. So let's do some reflection about this. So facing these, complex situations, there are, lights and shadows. There are, I would say, two narratives. So on the one hand, so the optimism of the International Energy Agency. We have listened to Fatih Birol, and so Fatih Birol and all the agency thinks that we are in the right direction, and that the technology is available, the technology is cost effective, and there will be a decrease in the emissions of all the fossils by the end, before the end of this decade. So things are going well, even if, of course, they recognize that we should be faster. And even in the formal documents of the UNFCCC, so this is the last technical report that was issued during the COP28. So they think that it's possible to cut emissions by half by 2030, just spending $100 per ton, which is something, not so high. It's high, but not so much. And even think that according to the NFCCC, half of this potential could be got at less than $20, which is very, very cheap. So there is the technology. There is a potential that is there that can be exploited at a cheap cost. And on the other hand, you have a pessimistic interpretation of the situation, and I quote 𝐕 Smith. So this is his last writing issued this year, and he thinks that that target will not be met. So cutting emissions by 45% by 2030 versus 2010. And he says that it's not true that we are reducing the level of our dependency on fossils, rather it is increasing, because the reasoning of Smith is we remain stuck at 80%, that is the weight of coal, oil, and natural gas on the global supply, energy supply. But the cake becomes larger and larger, and that means that we are using more fossils, so our dependency is increasing. And so there is a dialect between these two, I would say, extreme positions. So they are two extreme positions. So they have a content of truth both. There is, of course, a normative view in the Energy Agency approach. And there is more adherence to fact and the long-run trends in SMIL. So the International Energy Agency says, so look that we are entering into a new period, so they call the clean energy driven slowdown, because now, yes, emissions increase, but they increase less than the previous years, and that is something that comes from renewables. And so they say, yes, it is true that this year emissions grew by 1.1%, but I tell you that without renewables, the increase would have been more. And that is true. But as a result, we see that emissions are unfortunately increase. Again, SMIL looks at the long term, and I think that we have to reflect on the past transition, and so this is one of the merits of SMIL. So let's read here. So coal surpassed global wood combustion only in 1900. So in 1900 there is this emergence of coal, and its share of energy supply peaked only in the mid-60s, so 60 years. Only began to supply more than 20% of all fossil fuels nearly a century after its first modern commercial extraction, and natural gas after some 130 years. And so he says, so the problem is the combination of the scale and speed. So the scale is huge, is a super system, as he calls this. The energy system is a super system, is something enormous, very, very big. and the speed required is fast, and that is why he remains pessimistic about getting the target of net zero. So there are some problems. There are many problems. Of course, we don't have the time for looking at all the criticalities of this interesting issue, but we could focus on some main problems. I think that one of the problems is that in talking and phasing and analyzing this transition, we are focusing too much on the supply side. And there is this nice article by Grubler that was published about 10 years ago in Energy Policy. And this is a very interesting study on the transition. And it shows that if we study the transition in the US, where we have quite good data, we see that the transition is more an issue of the demand than supply. That is, in the US, since 1850 to 2000, final uses represent more than 87% of the total gigawatts involved in the transition, 87%. So, and on the contrary, we think that, I mean, pushing on the supply side, that is enough. That is important, of course. It's important increasing solar, wind, and hydrogen in the future at the supply side. But it is not enough. And what is happening is that money is going more towards demand than towards the supply. Less in this last year. So these are the data by Bloomberg. It's not the last report, because in the last report they had the network, so it is less readable, the graph. But you can see that here the money goes more towards the supply than demand, less in these recent years. Fortunately, there is a change, but that change must continue. The result of this situation, that is let me say, an excessive focus on the supply side, is that you have an expansion of renewables, but you don't see penetration of electricity. And so the renewables are faster than electricity, and the electricity is not penetrated in the TFC, the total final consumption, at it should be. That is because we are not pushing enough on the energy uses dimension. And let's see here some numbers. So the electricity penetration is low. What we need in order to have 50% of cleaner of electricity in the TFC, total final consumption, in 2050, as is required by the net zero scenario, is a penetration of 3.2% per year of the share of electricity. This is not happening. This is not happening. Here you see the different countries, and it is not happening. That is interesting. It is not happening, especially in rich countries. That is, in the countries that are investing more and are pushing more on the transition. So we remain quite far from that 3.2%. That is another problem. It's not so much discussed, but it is important. So it's something not visible, but electricity is not penetrating. Is not penetrating just in those countries where it should penetrate, because they are investing a lot. Another issue is the dimension of the funds. So we know this famous number, 4 trillion, that the International Energy Agency always stresses. That is, we should invest 4 trillion per year in clean energy if we want net zero. And now we are at 1.8, and there is some distance. No, the distance is quite big. However, we have some here, so 6 years. 6-7 years for reaching these 4 trillions. Let's go to see where these investments go. So when we go to do this analysis, we see that 3 areas attract 3/4 of this investment. They are China, they are the US and European Union. So 3/4 of the current expenses towards clean energy, 1.8 trillion now, goes to China, the US, and the European Union. And so 3/4, but they do not represent 3/4 of the emissions. They represent about 50% of the emissions. So here there is an imbalance, and the result is that a small amount of money goes to the emerging economy, this green area that is in the red rectangle here, in which there is the bulk of the world population. And this population is a population in which the energy consumption will increase. So this population will consume more and more energy because the level of per capita energy consumption is quite low, and it has to increase if we want to bring their better living conditions. And so something must be done, I mean, for expanding the investment. So there is a problem of where the investment goes, supply and demand, and also geographically where they go. These countries are important because even if at per capita level they emit not so much, but globally they emit a lot, and we see that in the last years, so the increase in emissions came just by these economies. So we had negative contributions by rich countries, let's say, but a positive contribution, that is, emissions increased in this area. So the money should flow more there and more at the demand side. So these are some, I mean, rough and simple reflections that we can do about the current situation. Possible improvements. So there were solutions. I don't have solutions, but I mean, some improvements can be done. First of all, let's say that I mean, Paris is the structure, the architecture that we have, and it has to remain, because it's not infrequent to listen to, I mean, reflections about, so we should change the paradigm. That is not that good. It happened already once with the abolishment of the Kyoto Protocol, and we spent a lot of years for rebuilding a new architecture. So the architecture is Paris, so it's not perfect, but some improvement can be done. Can a different design make this conference of the parties more efficient? We can split these questions in two ways. The one hand, we can ask, is it necessary to change the design for having more ambitious targets? What happens if, for instance, we do not pretend to have an agreement among 200 countries, but just, for instance, at the level of the G20, because there is the bulk of the emissions? So I personally think that that is something that would not bring a higher level of ambitions. That for a couple of reasons, because there are sessions about climate change that focuses on energy at the level of G7, G20, and the targets remain there. And also because now it is very, very simple to express new NDCs, not like as it was before. I mean, expressing an NDC is simple, and so countries can do that at any time. So I don't think it's an issue of design, but the design can bring faster decisions and rules. I think that is possible, and something can be done in this context. All the history of the negotiation process and histories of incremental improvements. So we had some improvement that brought us to the current situation. So that is not a perfect situation, but has some content of positivity. So an improvement was, I mean, to introduce these targets. So it took about 20 years, but finally it came. So the NDC, so that was a big improvement. We have to remember that before Paris, we did not have this method that the countries had to state their NDC, their targets before the conference. So the targets emerged during the conference. That was a very complex and tough process of negotiation within the conference, and it took a lot of energies. So that was a simple shift that actually came from the famous Copenhagen conference. It was one of the result of that conference that in the history is considered a negative conference, a flop, but in a way, that idea of targets, pledges expressed by the countries came from Copenhagen. And so this is a progress. I think this is a real progress. Now a country can easily express a new target simply by communicating it to the UNFCCC. The operational content is increasing. So in this context, COP28, I think is very, very important. So this acceptance in the Dubai Declaration of those two targets about renewables and energy efficiency is important. So Fatih Birol said about other targets, other pillars stressed by the International Energy Agency. So there is a reference to methane, but there is not the number. There is not a number in the Dubai Declaration. The number for the agency is -75% by 2030, and that is not translated into the declaration. Maybe it will be in the COP 29. In some areas, probably it is possible to get decisions by voting and not pretending full consensus by all the parties. So on this, there were many discussions that did not happen, but maybe there are some, narrow set of contents of issues that could be decided by qualified majorities, for instance. A lot of issues could be delegated to technical bodies and other subsidiary bodies for implementation for technologies. Here, I think there is a lot to be done because it's not necessary that all the technicalities, the rules of the game, so Article 6, voluntary markets, and so on and so forth, what remains of the CDM and so on, are agreed by all the countries. There must be an okay by the plenary. That takes a lot of energy, a lot of time. So there is an issue of delegation. So here some improvements are possible. Another area of improvement, I think, is communication. So here there is a lot to do because the communication of the UNFCCC, I think, is it would be explicit, is bad. I mean, you go to the website of the UNFCCC, you find a lot of good materials, but you don't have a clear view of what's happening, what is the situation. The people, citizens, but even the experts have problems in understanding what is the situation. It should be very, very clear, evident what is the situation, what is the gap, and what are the components of the gap. That is something that we can find in other analyses and other websites, but it should be within the UNFCCC. So these numbers should be like GDP. So we are always informed about the GDP. If GDP in any countries goes on or down, and so each quarter we know about it. The same should be for these numbers. And of course, outside this context, it is possible to have big improvements with a group of states, countries that join together and cooperate according to the Nordhaus ideas of the Climate Club. So they could cooperate for cutting the emissions, and probably in the next years, something like this would emerge, but of course this requires cooperation. These years, unfortunately, are not years of cooperation. So there are a lot of wars in the planet. So there is a lot of tension. There are a lot of tensions, geopolitical tensions, and so the situation is not good. But probably when we pass this tough moment, we will enter into a new cooperation age in which, subgroups of countries, so the European Union, the US, that could be a first start, could cooperate in forming climate clubs. In this, I am quite optimistic. I go to close with my final reflections. 3 questions and an image. So let's start with the first question. So the first question comes from this image, and it refers to willingness. So the problems that we saw are just something that emerged because there is an issue of weakness of will. So our willingness is not enough. For sure, our willingness is not enough. So we have seen that the ambition itself contained in the NDC is not enough. So the NDC are the thermometer, we could say, the meter of our ambition. And there we see that it is not enough. But I think that is not the problem. That is, or it is just a piece of the problem, because even if that ambition would be enough, there is an issue of implementation. That is, changing an energy system, even if there is a strong willingness to do that, is very, very complex. And I think that this stress that 𝐸 and the other authors do about the complexity of the transition is something on which we should reflect. Another question is this. Law. To what extent can a legal framework drive an energy transition? Because our implicit transition is that the protocol, the agreement, the Paris Agreement, that architecture drives the transition. And I think that the answer to this question is very little. That is, we must not pretend too much from that agreement. I mean, the legal framework cannot, drive, is not stronger than the laws. So the legal framework is not stronger than the economic laws. So the economic laws, the way in which the system works, has its own constraint that cannot be determined by the law. That even at the micro level, a court of justice cannot say, yeah, you company A, you have to cut your emissions, you have to bring your emissions to zero, because there is an issue of feasibility. There is an issue of constraint, technical constraint. So it's something that cannot be done because there are laws, economic laws of in the physics, unless you kill the company. Third question associated to the former one, politics, and the question is, to what extent can policymakers revolutionize in economic paradigm? And here our implicit assumption is that that is possible. That is, for the first time in history, we think that the policymakers should implement simply by establishing new rules, giving incentives, and so on, can implement an energy transition. That is the implicit assumption. That never happened in the history. There are many problems in driving an economy in Soviet style, as the history shows. And so I think we have to look at the history, what happened in the history. And that's for understanding the complexity of the transition, because if the ambition is too high, if you pretend too much, and it becomes a dream, and it kills the reality. The reality is killed, and maybe the dream kills itself because it is not able to realize itself. So that those were the 3 questions. I want to close with the last image. So that is the image. This image, as the previous 3 ones, were done by an artificial intelligence. The first 3 ones were done easily, and I wrote, so do this and this, and that was done. And it took a lot of time for me for doing this image. That is a man who is on a stone, is trying to lift this stone. I did at least 15 attempts because the artificial intelligence was not able to understand this situation, which is a paradoxical situation. It is an unreasonable situation. And I think finally I was able to do it. And I think it is a good, representation of the energy transition. That is, we have to lift a big stone on which we are. That is not easy. How to do it? I don't know how to do it. Probably that stone must be decomposed and then must be recomposed in a way or another. I think that Homo sapiens has a lot of skills, originality, creativity for doing it. The key issue is the time issue. We will be on time. So I think these are my considerations about this complex issue of negotiation, the transition. I hope to have given you, an idea of the complexity of the situation. And I thank you, all of you, very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I guess the situation from my perspective, considering that I'm Václav Smil fan club, he's absolutely a genius to some extent, that we are in a situation in which we are facing the, I don't know if there is any English translation, but there is the ottimismo della volontà e pessimismo della ragione.
Yeah.
This is exactly what we are facing now. I'm more skeptical that the average of people involved in climate change. I don't see the situation in a very optimistic way. And I think if you remember 1 second the way we decompose when we were young, decomposing the word in Kaya identity, and if you take the same number, you see that the problem is that what we are not doing is reducing the relation between CO2 and energy, so the carbon content of energy supply. But for the rest, we are doing our job more or less. So it's a technological / economical / political issue. There are other seminars that will follow. It's a great pleasure that I will give you the floor to Federico, Professor Pontoni, on Africa and the energy transition. Africa, COP and Italy. Nice title.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. Africa has already been discussed during this event. So Fatih Birol talked about the need for clean cooking in Africa and the damages that we have from the use of traditional biomass. Professor Corvaro spoke about the need for food security and to expand, of course, the climate finance and maybe revise the global financial architecture. And of course, Professor Di Giulio showed many interesting figures, and one of which, of course, is very important, and is the fact that most of the investments pertaining to the energy transition and more in general to mitigation and adaptation are targeting advanced economies. And we can add the statistics to that. Only 2% of the investments in renewable energies over the past decade have been targeting Africa. So this is my agenda, okay, so that you can follow through my speech till the end. I want to basically present and touch upon some key social and economic aspects in Africa, so that then we can put everything into context from the negotiating power and the demands of Africa at COP, the role that Italy can play, and then, of course, I will present some conclusions and policy recommendations. I think that it's important to anticipate some and to discuss some macroeconomic conditions and the macroeconomic outlook, because of course the economic situation and including the debt situation of the African continent, of course, is clearly intertwined with the demands of the continent vis-à-vis the negotiations, as well as the possibility to create a clear negotiating bloc that can advance some important requests. Of course, we are a research institute that is studying the energy transition and the effects of climate change. So while presenting the Africa's exposures to climate risks and the impacts that climate might have on the climate hazards and climate change can have on Africa economy, I will also present some evidence from different research streams that we are conducting here at the foundation. So first of all, we start with the macroeconomic outlook. So the macroeconomic outlook for Africa for 2024 and 2025 shows that we have, on the one hand, a sustained growth everywhere in Africa, in the different regions. On the other hand, we have clear heterogeneity, because we have a very strong growth and sustained growth in East Africa, which will be above 5%, and a very sluggish growth in Southern Africa, which will be around 1 to 2%. That has to do with, on the one hand, the role that Kenya and Ethiopia have in their transition to a more manufacturing type of economy, as well as increased integration in the Eastern Africa bloc, while Southern Africa, of course, has a sluggish growth because of the continuous problems that the biggest economy there, which is South Africa, is facing. And what we know now is that basically South Africa, which once was the biggest economy in the continent, now is losing to Egypt and Nigeria, which are growing fast. And we can see that the group in West Africa is going to grow at around 4%. So on average, the African continent will grow more than 4%. So it will outpace the growth of the global growth by more than 1%. Even though the economic growth is slowed down by many external shocks. And in any case, 11 of the 20 fastest growing economy will be in the continent. So from the production point of view, so the GDP point of view, the situation is good and the economy is recovering from COVID and from the inflation and from the external shocks, which are mainly the war in Russia and Ukraine, that have created energy shocks, and for Africa, in reality, they have basically created food shocks, because Africa is a big food importer. On the other hand, when it comes to the financial situation, and in particular the debt, the situation has been worsening over the past years, and that is because, of course, the need to respond to the COVID pandemic. So also African countries, even with their very limited fiscal space, have spent money to support the economy. And because of the increase in the interest rates, the debt service in Africa now is becoming unsustainable for many economies. You see that the debt service will total 80 billion. I decided to put that figure to put into context the fact that at COP, so the whole architecture of COP foresees annual payments or annual investments in climate-related measures in Africa that should achieve 100 billion. So we never achieved those 100 billion. And the reality is that, on the other hand, that the debt service that Africa has to pay to the rest of the world has achieved the 80 billion. And in the next 2 years, it will achieve the 100 billion. So we have achieved 100 billion, but not of money flowing into Africa, but money flowing out of Africa because of the debt service. And you see that in Africa now we have 750 basis points above in the standard market rates in terms of spread. And that has led to the fact that 21 African countries are already either at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. So Ghana defaulted on the debt, Ethiopia defaulted on the debt, Zimbabwe defaulted on the debt, Egypt is likely to default on the debt very soon. And so the situation from a financial and debt point of view is in distress, and this might create also further geopolitical tensions. And you see that there are many countries for which most of the government revenues are devoted to the debt service, meaning that there is very little fiscal space for investments, for health, for subsidies, and of course for climate resilience, adaptation, and the energy transition. So this shows the urgency of a new global financial architecture that can provide answers to African economies, which on the one hand are performing very well when it comes to GDP, on the other hand are still trapped in a debt situation. So let's put Africa into context also when it comes to the emissions, climate change, and the energy transition. So we have seen from Professor Giulio's slides the situation and the emissions of the different advanced economies. We know that it is a matter of China, India, United States, and Europe, depending whether we consider historical emissions, whether we consider current emissions, whether we consider consumption-based emissions or production-based emissions. The reality is that Africa is completely outside of this game. Africa is not emitting, okay, because it contributes only to less than 4% of the world global emissions. And historically, it has not emitted because out of the stock, only 2.9% can be attributed to Africa, and most of which is South Africa. So basically, African economies and African countries are not emitting, have never emitted, and that could tell us that they should have a wild card for emissions while others do their homework. And not only because Africa has never emitted and it is still not emitting CO2, that we should probably consider giving Africa a wild card, but also because the impacts of climate change are likely to be worse in Africa than in other regions. Okay, so this is projections from the IPCC, and we see that basically heat waves are more likely under any climate scenario. In Africa, the distribution pattern of rainfalls will dramatically change. And of course, the further we move to the right, the worse is the scenario that is described. And what happens is that we will have less precipitations in equatorial Africa and maybe higher levels of precipitation in the desert, completely changing the patterns and affecting, therefore, livelihood and agricultural productivity. And we expect higher levels of floods and more severe droughts in some areas. Okay, and what is relevant here is that the impacts of climate change is not that they are going to happen, but they are already happening. So what we see here in the bars is the GDP per capita lost due to climate change over the past 20 years. So Africa is at the forefront, unfortunately, of the devastating effects of climate change, because we have already seen that there has been an increase in extreme weather events that are climate related. And of course, right now is impacting both countries that are in the desertic areas or close by, like the Sahel countries. So we see that the worst off are Mauritania, Mali, and Niger, and Sudan. But we see that everyone is impacted because of rainfall that are already changing their patterns. And of course, we know well what is going on even right now in the Horn of Africa. And then we see on the right-hand side what could happen if we do not act and we have a temperature increasing up to 4 degrees. We could have a loss of up to 90% of GDP per capita in Africa compared to a scenario with no climate change. And that will be everywhere from 60 to 90%. But the worst countries would be in Central and Western Africa, because that would basically lead the desertification in their northern territories. So basically the Sahara Desert advancing into the Sahel and then advancing even into West Equatorial Africa. We also see that, of course, maintaining the temperature increase below 2 degrees would dramatically benefit Africa, and in particular, we see that that would be mostly beneficial to Egypt, and that is because, of course, it would not impact dramatically the agricultural productivity of African countries. And we see that keeping it to 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees, it's going to increase GDP per capita everywhere, and that is basically it's not a probability, but it's basically, according to the estimates of the IPCC, it's something that will happen. The possibility of this happening is 100%. So we have strong economic growth, problems with the debt and financial issues. We have a continent that has not been emitting, and it is still not emitting compared to all the others. And we have a continent that is the most exposed to climate change. So what are FEEM studies doing to better understand the dynamics of the social and economic dynamics of climate change in Africa, and why some of our studies could support the science and the stakeholders and the policymakers when it comes to COP, as we will see later on. Well, at FEEM, we are conducting many studies that, of course, are focusing on Africa, or at least on some regions of Africa. The first one that you see here is a European project which is called 𝕼𝐴𝐷, where we are assessing the climate, economy, agriculture nexus in the Mediterranean basin down to the Horn of Africa. And basically, we have developed a model which is called the 𝐅𝐫𝐾 that allows to assess the economic impacts of climate change on GDP and selected sectors, particularly the agricultural sector, with a very high level of granularity. And then this model is further developed, will include more countries, probably will go down to sub-regional, to subnational scale. And it is now feeding a new general equilibrium model that FEEM is developing with Israeli partners. So what we see here is that we have developed specific damage functions that allow to determine, in particular, the impact on agricultural outputs. And what we see, okay, I will not delve into this complex research, but what you see in the figure that we have on top and then in the figure that we have above, below, sorry, is that if we act faster and if we introduce stricter environmental and measures and emission reduction targets, then the agricultural output will suffer less. So because of the fact that in any case we will have climate change inevitably, so the agricultural production and agricultural productivity will go down in any case. But if we act now, if we act faster, then the contraction in agricultural productivity in selected African countries in the Mediterranean basin will be lower. And therefore, this is an important result that shows policymakers the impacts of a more urgent policy on climate change for the African agricultural sector. Another research that we have conducted, and I want to compliment Giulia for this. She's been working on this for years, and she's part of her PhD thesis, is the complex dynamics between drought and deforestation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we know, for instance, that droughts are more likely to bring about deforestation, but the dynamics are not so straightforward. There is more complexity, and that is important to understand the dynamics and this complexity, because then we can inform better policymakers when it comes not just to design policies that aim at combating deforestation, and of course why we focus on the Congo, on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because it's one of the biggest equatorial forests, which is very important for oxygen production and for regulating the global climate. And so we see that depending on the moment at which we have the manifestation of drought, deforestation could either increase or in reality decrease, because the forests could provide a safety net for villagers. So we should not always consider drought as a driver for deforestation, but we must have better and more detailed data to understand these interactions, so that we can design policies that in reality could reduce or halt deforestation by working together with rural communities that already know that the forests might serve as a safety net, and therefore we shouldn't always blame these communities for deforestation. And another study that we have been carrying out is related to what I've said before. So Africa is basically never emitted and probably should be given a wild card. So at international level, we have been talking about the transition away from fossil fuels. So the director of the agency stressed the fact that at COP28 finally we have included this term, so the transitioning away from fossil fuels. We have seen that we should have a transition that is technologically neutral, but we also know that fossil fuels will accompany this transition, in particular that of gas. And transition in a way doesn't mean that we stop using fossil fuels tomorrow. The problem is that if we look at many scenarios, including the ones that we are presenting here, the ones that will either not produce fossil fuels or will not use fossil fuels are African countries. So the idea is that while we transition away from fossil fuels, because we have to reduce consumption of fossil fuels, the incumbent producers will keep on producing fossil fuels from Norway to Saudi Arabia, and we will not extract fossil fuels from Africa. So here we are showing the case of Mozambique. So Mozambique is a country that has recently discovered gas, that is investing to export gas, and we see that with the red curve, what is going to be the situation if Mozambique can benefit from its gas exports. So we see that the government debt is going to be stabilized. We see that the balance of payments is going to be even. We see that, of course, revenues from natural gas will increase, and we see that the economy will grow. Of course, also emissions will grow. On the other hand, on the green curve, we see what happens with the blue curve. We see, or the light blue curve, we see what would happen with the net zero transformation. So it's a global scenario where we reach a net zero by 2050. So Mozambique would be the first one of the countries to not put into production its gas reserves. And we see that basically its balance of payment would collapse, the debt of the government would explode, and the GDP would reduce by more than 11% compared to the business as usual scenario. So what we did is, let's keep the energy transition, let's keep the net zero, but let's redistribute the production. So instead of having Norway or Saudi Arabia or whatever other big incumbent that already has the money to finance its energy transition, let's leave Mozambique with the possibility to benefit from the last barrels of oil or the last cubic meters of gas. Okay, so we at a global level we will achieve net zero, but in a more equitable way. Let's have Mozambique benefit for this next 25 years from its gas, and that is the red curve. And what you the green curve. And what you see is that basically we achieve more or less the same level in terms of economic output and economic benefits without altering the net zero. So this is again a matter of not just designing a global transition, but designing a just transition. And at FEEM we are developing this kind of models. And this is basically all our models and our policy insights. We hope that are not just taken into account by policymakers, but they can also inform negotiations and, of course, also support the Africa's demands. So let's. So the topic of this whole meeting is from COP28 to COP29. So let's see what are the takeaways for Africa and the main negotiating points at COP29. So first of all, for the first time, I would say at COP adaptation is really on the table. Okay, so far we have discussed about mitigation. Of course, adaptation is always there, but we don't really have a framework for adaptation. And as because we have already seen that African countries are not experiencing just a threat from climate change, but are already experiencing the damages of climate change, they have been advocating for the fact that we need a framework for adaptation and not just a framework for mitigation. So it is not just a matter of investing in renewables, but it is already a matter of investing money to make agriculture resilient. So we have this framework, which is the recognition and the acknowledgement of the fact that we must have an adaptation framework, and therefore we must quantify mitigation measures, and we must finance adaptation measures, and of course we also must plan adaptation measures. So this is good. On the other hand, at COP29, the African parties will push for stronger ambitions when it comes to the deployment and implementation of this framework that will probably be then fully developed at COP30. Another point is the loss and damage fund. So recognizing that some countries are already experiencing damages related to climate change. And of course, that is a good win for Africa in political terms. But then the negotiations, of course, as anticipated by Professor Corvaro, is that the fund, of course, is less than 1 billion. And estimates from the United Nations show that Africa will experience damages in between 300 to 400 billion in this decade. So it is clear that having a fund that can only cover 1 billion in damages is very little compared to the damages that are expected. So this relates also to climate finance. We need a new global architecture for climate finance because climate finance is simply not working. We never achieved the 100 billion annually, and now the continent requires up to 250 billion annually to invest in mitigation measures on top of the needs for adaptation measures. As for energy transition, the tripling of renewables could be a booster for African economies because of the abundant solar and wind and hydropower resources, so and the untapped potential that we have in the continent. And this could also accelerate energy access. I want to remember the fact that 40% of the population in Africa doesn't have access to electricity yet. And of course, because of the fact that we are talking about investments in renewable energy sources, critical minerals are fundamental for the deployment and the tripling of investments, and Africa is full of critical minerals. So Africa could leverage on this. On the other hand, we have to remember that we must couple investments in renewable energies with energy access, and we must acknowledge that up until recently, only 2% of renewable investments have targeted Africa, and we cannot have this tripling of investments miss out Africa, otherwise it would be another lost opportunity. For food systems, Professor Corvaro showed and told us the importance of food security, and for the first time at COP, it was recognized that food security is a political priority, and it is part of climate change, and of course it speaks to adaptation. And that is very important because that is a key geopolitical issue and a key political element for African economies. And they were probably hit very hard by the war between Russia and Ukraine, because the food prices went up, and that led to many social tensions. And it is clear that investments in the agri-food sector is very important, not just to make it resilient, but to make it even more productive, because you see that Africa has 25% of the world's arable land, but it is only producing 10% of the global agricultural output. So it means that we can dramatically increase the levels of agricultural productivity in Africa, and we basically can bring an agricultural revolution in the continent. And as for climate change and development, what the African countries will do is that they will push even harder in linking climate change to development, and basically in what I said before, asking for a wild card when it comes to at least some of the emissions, because we cannot trade climate investments and mitigation measures or adaptation measures with economic development, but we must create a new system and a new narrative that links together development and the transition in Africa. So what can Italy do in this context and for Africa? Well, first of all, Italy is the president of the G7, and so it will play a more important role than other years, because it must lead the G7 in the reform or in launching the process that will reform the global climate finance architecture, because as it is now, it is not working, and we have many proofs of that. And last year there was a summit in Paris that was discussing the way in which we can revise the global financial architecture and mobilize more finance to African countries. That goes from redesigning the special drawing rights of the IMF, excluding adaptation and mitigation investments from the public accounts, or at least from the computation of the debts. And this is going to be a very important role that Italy and the G7 will play, also because of the geopolitical tensions that we have around the world. Professor Corvaro anticipated that, but it also told us that they want to bring something which is more inclusive and less contentious, and that inevitably has to do with food security. So food security is an issue in Africa, and in the spirit of this priority and the experience that Italy has in developing resilient agri-food value chains, we must acknowledge the fact that the Mattei plan, which is a new basically policy, African policy for Italy and for the government, is not only putting some money to foster and accelerate development in Africa. So it's more or less 5.5 billion, which we could say that is a drop in the ocean, but it is at least better than nothing. But what is important is the spirit of the plan that is basically targeting the agri-food sector, or water and agri-food sector, because as you can see, we have 9 pilot projects, and most of the projects are on the agri-food sector, either because they target directly agriculture, like those ones in Mozambique and in Egypt, either because they target water systems like the ones in Tunisia or Ethiopia, and the satellite agriculture in Algeria. So only and even the project in Kenya is in between agriculture and energy, because basically it's a project on biofuel. So there is only one project that is not focused on either energy or the agri-food sector, which is supporting Côte d'Ivoire for a further strengthening of the health sector. So this is a role that Italy, as we have seen, can play, and it speaks to basically everything that we have seen. So the priorities of the African continent, so the debt relief and increasing the resilience of the agricultural sector. This has been also demonstrated by some of the studies that we are conducting. We have many more research projects on Africa, including another European project, which is basically providing African governments with open source modeling tools to have clearer and more transparent policies on energy transition. And it can lead us to some conclusions and some policy recommendations. So we have seen that the macroeconomic conditions of the continent have some goods and some bads. So on the positive side, the economic growth is strong. It has been strong, but inflation and political tensions could reduce economic outputs. Political tensions not just in Africa, but at the international level, because the coupling of global value chains or stronger competition between China and the US might impact also economic output and economic productivity in the continent. At the same time, we have high interest rates and high debt service are reducing the fiscal space for African governments. We have seen already that climate change is affecting dramatically Africa, even though Africa does not bear any responsibility in emissions, and therefore we see clearly some policy recommendation. A new global financial architecture is by far the most pressing needs, and it is by far the most pressing need not just for climate finance, but for international finance in general. Let me remind you the tragic example of Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is defaulted on the debt a couple of years ago. Then a new president was elected, and basically after 2 years, the Paris Club and China have not found an agreement, and therefore Zimbabwe cannot access the international market, cannot receive money, and now it is battered by droughts and severe extreme weather events, and the agricultural production has been destroyed, and the president is saying that it has been 2 years, agreements have not been found, and he has no access to the international markets to provide food to its population and to combat the consequence of a severe extreme weather events. So this is very important, and it is an urgent matter, even though it's a contentious matter. So we hope that Italy could leverage on its historic diplomatic capacity to speed up a reform of the global financial architecture. That includes, of course, the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, which could, for instance, could be a relief for Zimbabwe, and that must be led, I think, also by the G7, that must take a bold action and commitments also to show that it is and it will remain a credible partner for developing countries. And finally, on food security is a priority for the continent. And luckily enough, it is also a priority for Italy and for this and for the Italian government. And we can see that there is a lot of room for cooperation and for supporting African countries in advancing negotiations and agreements and plans, and hopefully also financing in this sector, because we can have a further agricultural revolution in Africa. And with this, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your precise and presentation, which is full of very nice ideas, and I hope we can transfer my idea, of course, is transfer all these documents and our thoughts to Professor Corvaro, that I think will find useful, considering his role in this moment, COP and the G7 situation and the Mattei plan. I'll give you the floor to Professor Galeotti to draw some conclusions, and then we can stop just in time as promised. Marzio.
Thank you very much. I was thinking how I could try to draw some conclusions or wrap up this very fruitful meeting this morning. And I think that I could make three short points. The first one is a brief summary of what we heard, besides the broad perspective and overview on the COP mechanism offered by Enzo, Di Giulio, by Professor Di Giulio. Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, reminded us what has been happening since COP28, the main topics in the agenda that will be on the table also on COP29, and all the progress at the highest institutional level that has been taking place during this period since last November. Then we heard from Professor Corvaro what are the important issues to which of the future COP to which Italy can contribute or aims to contribute, and among them, and besides the ones that we know, renewable energy efficiency and so on, a stress was put on agriculture, the security of agriculture, food security and agricultural, sustainable agriculture, adaptation, the role of all technologies, not excluding CCS, nuclear and so on, and especially and interestingly, the issue of the digital transition, and finally, the role of Africa and the Mattei plan on which you heard of Federico, touching upon in a broad way on this issue. I'm mentioning these things because, and obviously we just heard Federico Pontoni, Professor Pontoni. He is the program director at FEEM of a program which is a research program called the Technologies for the Energy Transition, who read basically the COP28 and COP29 issues through the lens of Africa. FEEM is active in this respect, is active on issues that are at the heart of the COP meetings through its research activities. And here I would like to mention, besides what has been the issue that I just mentioned, the fact that in the Federico Pontoni's program, we are interested and we are studying issues related to carbon capture and sequestration, for instance. To nuclear energy, we are just opened a project on nuclear fusion. We are looking at the Africa in a broad sense, as you just heard, but we also have a program on adaptation with special reference to coastal zones. That is a research program at FEEM. And we also participated in an observatory joint with Ambrosetti on the twin transitions, because digital and energy transition are closely intertwined. And they are related by, among other things, one common factor, which is the issue of critical raw materials that is relevant and is on the table, continuously on the table, and it is relevant also from an African perspective. We opened a new research program which started this year, precisely devoted to the issue of critical raw materials. So FEEM is present and active with its research activity, as I said, and also it stands ready to participate into the policy debate and into the support to policymakers, also in a related aspect, given that this year the G7 is chaired by Italy. So we are not only are we present at the COP meetings, but also we provide support in the various G7 meetings. Finally, I would like to conclude with just one thought, and perhaps a very simple consideration or remark that has been not mentioned throughout the morning. We are following, as I said, all the work that takes place between one COP and the other, because the work never stops. But it ends up in November or every year with this big meeting, and the next year will be in Baku, as we know. It will be November 2024. And a few weeks before that, we have the US election. And we know what is at stake, and in particular, who are the two main candidates: the continuity of President Biden, or perhaps the disruption by Donald Trump. It is clear that the sentiment of the future COP, besides all these important issues in the agenda, and even the success of the most important issues that in a way or another are related to mitigation, to the issue of phasing out of fossil fuels, transition away and so on, will be greatly dependent on this important political political election. So there is a large part of the world, including ourselves, who are crossing their fingers, because while we work and make all the efforts toward the full decarbonization of economies, we know that this decarbonization has to be just, as Federico just reminded us, but it also has to be as complete and as full as possible. And notwithstanding, there is, as we know, and we saw in Dubai and probably also in Baku, big resistance on some parts, on some actors, hopefully not on the main, on the second emitter in the world. With this, I stop and I thank you very much. Please stay with us, stay tuned, because as I said, FEEM will be active on the COP front. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marzio. And I'm not going to make a summary of the summary of the summary. I just need to thank everyone that so generously participated to this meeting, starting from Fatih, Birol, Francesco Corvaro, Enzo, Giulio, Federico Pontoni, and of course all the staff of Fondazione. They made, as usual, with generosity, these events possible. So next time, stay tuned. We are always acting in these fields. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you.